I got some really good friends here today. This is so special to me that you take your time to come and hear the talk. Pope John the 23rd. We call him now Saint Pope John the 23rd. If there ever was a pope who embodied the character we read about in the book of James, where we are exhorted to show a good life in the meekness of wisdom, that was embodied in John the 23rd. He became pope as a very elderly man, and he died in office in 1963. He became pope in 1958, and he's known for his sense of humor. So I've decided to tell two stories about him to give you an idea of his sense of humor. The first one is just after he became pope, he went to the place known as the Holy Office, which used to be called, in the Middle Ages, the Office of the Inquisition. Call it the Holy Office. And that's where they kept their files on people that they suspected of various doctrinal problems. And he walked into the Holy Office now. He was pope. He was had just been made pope. And he smiled. And he said to the person in charge of the office, "Give me my file." And the people at the man at the Holy Office says, "Oh no, Holy Father, it doesn't matter anymore." No, he smiled and he said, "Give me my file." And the third time, he said, "Give me my file." Finally, the man went back and got his file. He opened it up. It said, "Angelo Roncalli," which is his name, "suspected of being a modernist." And he took a pen out. He wrote across the bottom of the file, "I am not a modernist. John the 23rd. And he clapped the file back and he handed it back to the guy and said, "You can put it away now." That's one example. The other one was when they asked him, "How many people work at the Vatican?" You know what he said? "About half." But his extraordinary contribution to history is two things, okay? He called Vatican Council II, okay? It was unexpected. He was put in as sort of a caretaker. They thought, he's so old, he won't do anything of consequence. And he felt the Holy Spirit nudge him to open up the Vatican Council. And he prayed to the Holy Spirit and he opened up the Vatican Council. And the other thing he did is he pulled off a negotiation that led in the direction of peace at the time that things were looking very, very dark and turning toward war. He initiated these negotiations at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's what I want to look at to start. The outline for today, just to give you an idea of how this talk is going to go, is we're going to look at the history of what Saint Pope John the 23rd did to work for peace between Kennedy and Khrushchev. We're going to look then at his teaching on peace and how it reveals three things. It reveals fatherhood, spiritual fatherhood, how it relates to truth, and how it relates to suffering love. And when we put it together, we're going to see something really remarkable about this holy pope. Okay? Although John Kennedy was in deepening conflict. This is taken from a book I recommend if you want to read a good book on this period of history. Jim Douglas wrote a book called JFK and the Unspeakable. And in this book, he accounts for Pope John the 23rd's interactions with Kennedy and Khrushchev around this time. Although John Kennedy was in deepening conflict with his own Cold War government, he was supported in his turn toward peace by two very unlikely allies: a dying pope and a beleaguered communist. In the final year of Kennedy's life, Pope John the 23rd and Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev became the president's greatest allies in his pursuit of peace. They made all the difference. Without them, his isolation would have been almost complete. With them, he could begin to lay the foundations for a more peaceful world. The unlikely trio began to work together for peace in the midst of an equally unlikely event for such collaboration, the Cuban Missile Crisis. With the active support of the Pope and the Pope's secret peacemaking agent, a New York journalist named Norman Cousins, this whole drama unfolded. So, bring yourself back to October 1962. There's a group of leading Soviet academicians, writers, and scientists, and a corresponding group of Americans get together at a secluded place, even more secluded than the west end of Mishawaka here, in Andover, Massachusetts. They had journeyed there secretly for a frowned-upon exercise in the frigid atmosphere of Cold War politics. They were seeking peace. Their quiet purpose in a week-long dialogue was to overcome East-West conflicts. Norman Cousins, editor of the Saturday Review, and the founder of a group called the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, was the prime mover of this gathering. On the first night, it turned out, they all had to huddle around their television set because they were listening to President Kennedy announce the Cuban Missile Crisis on the TV. Confronted by this apocalyptic conflict, they agreed unanimously to continue their meeting. They spent the week debating intensely, but respectfully, the questions involved in the crisis. They were sharply divided along national lines, but they all shared a deep desire to find a way out of the crisis. And into this volatile situation, this volatile peace-seeking community, there was a visitor from the Vatican. He was Father Felix Morlian, and he was an advisor to John the 23rd. He told Cousins about the Pope. This is what he said: all the world will come to acclaim and love this gentleman, Pope John. He's not arbitrary or fixed. He has a profound respect for people of all faiths. He wants to help save the peace. Father Morlian asked the members of both delegations, hey, might a papal intervention in the Cuban crisis, even if it's only in the form of an appeal for greater responsibility, serve an important purpose? And Cousins phoned the White House, and he talked to Kennedy's speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, he was an advisor, who consulted with the president. The president responded, I welcome the offer of Pope John's intervention. A member of the Soviet delegation did the same thing, contacting Khrushchev. And the Russians said, sure. At the meeting, Father Morlian also raised the possibility of further negotiations through an intermediary, and they picked Cousins to be that intermediary. Would that be acceptable to Moscow? The Russians said sure. When Norman Cousins arrived in Moscow, in his meeting with Khrushchev, Cousins learned how much Pope John had impressed the Soviet premier. This is what Khrushchev said: "I'm not religious, but I can tell you I have a great liking for Pope John. There's something very moving to me about a man like him struggling, despite his illness, to accomplish such an important goal before he dies. His goal, as you say, is peace. It's the most important goal in the world." And then he went on. "During that week of the Cuban crisis," he said, "the Pope's appeal was a real ray of light. I was grateful for it." Cousins asked, "How did it feel to have your fingers so close to the nuclear trigger?" Khrushchev said, "The Chinese say I was scared. Of course I was scared. It would have been insane not to have been scared. I was frightened about what could happen to my country or your country and all the other countries that would be devastated by nuclear war. If being frightened meant that I helped avert such insanity, then I'm glad I was frightened. One of the problems in the world today is not enough people are sufficiently frightened by the danger of nuclear war. Anyway, most people are smart enough to understand that it's ridiculous to talk in terms of another war. Pope John understands this. I would like to express my appreciation to him for what he did during the crisis of the Cuban Week." And then they had some more conversation, and Cousins thought it was time to go. The American stood up to leave, feeling he might have outstayed his welcome, actually. Yet, he had not brought up matters that concerned President Kennedy. "Please sit down," Khrushchev said, reading Cousins' mind. He asked, "And how is President Kennedy?" This is great. Answered by Cousins that the president was in good health and spirits, Khrushchev proceeded to explore the possibilities of further dialogue. And after that, Cousins flew to Rome and met with Pope John, giving him the warm written messages from both Kennedy and Khrushchev. The two Cold War leaders were deeply aware of Pope John's pain and approaching death, and the Pope was becoming a dying bridge between them. And you know what the Pope said? He said, "Pain is no foe of mine. Wonderful memories give me great joy now and fill my life. There's really no room for the pain." Cousins went on and reported his meeting with Khrushchev, and Pope John smiled and said, "Much depends now on keeping open and strengthening all possible lines of communication. As you know, I asked the statesmen in October to exercise the greatest restraint and do all that had to be done to reduce the terrible tension. My appeal was given prominent attention inside the Soviet Union. I was glad this was so. This is a good sign. World peace is mankind's greatest need. I'm old, but I'll do what I can in the time I have." But the problem was, to the discouragement of Kennedy and Khrushchev, things started to get cold again in their dialogue. And there were different reasons for that. And the Pope became more alarmed that things weren't going well. So he prepared to respond to the threat with the most important statement of his papacy, Peace on Earth, his encyclical. Here we have it. It's also called Pacem in Terris in Latin. You know how the tradition in the church is to name an encyclical by the first Latin words. And Peace on Earth is this. When Cousins met with Khrushchev in April, they dealt with the questions of mistrust. Khrushchev again asked about Pope John's health, adding, I have often thought of and been inspired by Pope John's desire to contribute to world peace in whatever time remains to him. Cousins then thought this was an appropriate time to do something that was really dramatic here. What he did is he gave Khrushchev an advance copy of Pacem in Terris, of this very document, before anyone else got one. The only people who knew the document at that point were people in the Vatican. So after expressing his pleasure to get this, Khrushchev asked a good question. Are there any parts of this encyclical that ought to be discussed now? Okay, even before I've read it. That's a smart thing to ask, I think. Cousins then brought to the attention of his communist partner in dialogue the key passages of Pacem in Terris. And they included this one. If disarmament is to come about, the fundamental principle on which our present peace depends must be replaced by another, which declares that the true and solid peace of nations can consist not in equality of arms, but in mutual trust alone. Think of how bold that comment is on the part of the Pope to say that. Khrushchev nodded. He again praised Pope John's service to the world peace. He said he would study the encyclical carefully. Thus challenged by the Pope to deepen in trust, Khrushchev and Cousins turned to issues of mutual distrust, the inspections, and they discussed them. And it wasn't going to go anywhere because the Senate would want one thing and the Russians wanted another, and there was an impasse. Well, said Khrushchev, and then Cousins looked at him and said, you're looking at a depressed man. I came here for the purpose of bearing witness to the president's good faith. You have apparently placed little weight on this. Your final response is you're probably going to resume the tests, the nuclear tests. And then we'll test after you test, and the test, and it'll go on and on. And that will destroy any possibility, and it'll poison the, and none of this adds anything to Russian or American security. And he continued, but he doggedly continued to talk with Khrushchev. And finally, Khrushchev answered him. Okay, very well, he said. You want me to accept President Kennedy's good faith? All right, I accept President Kennedy's good faith. You want me to believe that the United States sincerely wants a treaty banning nuclear tests? All right, I believe the United States is sincere. You want me to set all misunderstandings aside, make a fresh start? All right, I agree to a fresh start. Khrushchev sighed and sat back in his chair. He said, you can tell the president that I accept his explanations of honest misunderstandings and suggest that we get moving, but the next move is up to him. Okay, so the ball's in Kennedy's court. Now, but as I said before, the negotiation stance there was deadlocked because of the positions of the Senate and so on. Kennedy and Khrushchev had reached an impossible negotiating situation that Khrushchev, through Cousins, had just tossed back to Kennedy. The next move is up to him. But he didn't have much room to move. And the president looked at Cousins, when Cousins got back to Washington, and said, the more I learn about this business, the more I learn how difficult it is to communicate on the really important matters, right? Cousins then, after a while, told Kennedy that he regretted deeply that he had failed in his mission to Moscow. But Kennedy looked at Cousins and said, I can't accept the fact of failure. We have to try and find some way of getting through and breaking the deadlock. And he looked intently at Cousins. Do you have any suggestions? He asked. Cousins said, I feel the stage may be set now for what might be the most important single speech since you came into office. That's what's needed. It's a breakthrough, a new approach toward the Russian people, calling for an end to the Cold War and a fresh start in American-Russian relationships. The president lit a thin cigar. I'd like to think about it, he said. He asked Cousins to write a memorandum for him on the subject. But John Kennedy was now ready to talk peace. On June 10th, at American University, JFK took the idea and he gave this address, this famous address, which you can look at. You can watch it on YouTube, by the way. It's very moving to hear Kennedy in the American University address. And that address really owed a lot to Parchamenteris. And the Pope knew from Norman Cousins just how opportune and useful it was to have that shuttle diplomacy back and forth. So the U.S. president, in his greatest speech, echoed the call of Parchamenteris for cooperation with an ideological opponent. In the American University address, Kennedy made the same kind of distinction the Pope did. And then came the heart of the speech, the most eloquent statement of John F. Kennedy's presidency. Remember it? So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Kennedy asked us all here to re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War, remembering that we are not engaged in a debate seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. I just, in parentheses, remember the first talk on John Donne, his method of theology. His method of theology, what did he say it was? Not to win debates. Instead, stack up insight and grow toward truth. That was John Donne's point, and it's mirrored in Parchamenteris and in what Kennedy said in the American University address. It's very interesting. So he went on and he talked about the process getting started with the unilateral decision on the Americans' part to stop testing, if you know about that. When Kennedy spoke about this from his heart at American University, Khrushchev had ears to hear. He said it was the greatest speech by an American president since Roosevelt. John the 23rd, meanwhile, died of cancer on June 3rd, 1 week before Kennedy gave that address. With the publication of Parchamenteris in April of that year, the Pope's work for world peace was done. On his deathbed, he felt it was far too little. He feared that his family, all of humanity, would experience the agony of another terrible war. Norman Cousins, the Pope's unofficial and unattached emissary, had not, as he feared, been a failure to either Khrushchev or Kennedy. By conveying to the two Cold War leaders that courageous vision found in Peace on Earth, he was able to help them to wage peace rather than war. The immediate legacy of this little document, Parchamenteris, amazing. It was to increase the increasingly hopeful Kennedy-Khrushchev détente. And that's what happened. When we call Saint Pope John the 23rd the Pope for Peace on Earth, we see that in the case of Kennedy and Khrushchev, Pope John actually aided these two men very directly at a most critical time. The results were that the very words of the encyclical were fulfilled. Peace developed through mutual trust rather than by force, and we should all read this document. You know, this is like basic reading. Everyone should learn Parchamenteris. So I'm going to take you on 3 points about Parchamenteris to help you read it, okay? I mean, I could actually distribute it at another time, but the issue is, let's think about how we might read it. And there's 3 points to a contemplative reading of Pacem Terris. The first is fatherhood, spiritual fatherhood. You should think about this encyclical by seeing it as a last will and testament of a father to his children. It embodies the father's wish for enduring peace, his well-being, and the entire family. It's addressed with a father's love and urgency to the deepest problems of the world. Pope John loved the world and spoke to it directly. This is a great line from Douglas, who wrote this. Pope John loved the world and spoke to it directly, not through the cracks in the church's walls. In other words, he didn't shout at the world through the cracks in the church's walls. Maybe kind of like I'm doing here, right? No, what he did is he addressed the world directly, and he left every wall behind him to embrace the world's deepest needs as a father would his sons. In his journal for December 1959, 1 year after he became Pope, he wrote this. Just think about this. Since the Lord chose me, unworthy as I am, for this great service, I feel I have no longer any special ties in this life. No family, no earthly city or nation. Now more than ever, I see myself only as the humble and unworthy servant of God and servant of the servants of God. The whole world is my family. This sense of belonging to everyone must give character and vigor to my mind, my heart, my actions. So the human family as a whole, it's an essence of his vision. For Pope John to justify war in any form would have been a denial of communion with his family. The justification of war demands the division of mankind into just and unjust killers, into one's own on one hand and the enemy to be driven out on the other. What father can so divide his sons, especially in an age when battle would kill them all? Pope John embraced them all. It was when he had reached the summit of his life that the man who no longer had any special ties in this life, no family, no earthly country or nation, and for whom the whole world was a family, was moved to write his encyclical on peace. Second point for a contemplative reading of Pacem Terris is truth. Okay? So, fatherhood, truth, and suffering love. Those are the three ways into the encyclical. Truth. Pope John wrote Pacem Terris, wrote this. This is what he said about truth. This is very philosophical, and we may want to break it down for the discussion, but I want you to hear it anyway. In every human being, there is a need that is congenital to his nature and never becomes extinguished, compelling him to reach through the web of error and open his mind to the knowledge of truth. It's congenital to us. We've got to have truth. Okay? Now get this. And God, now let's talk about God in this whole thing. Because he's the Pope, after all. He can say a few things about God and get away with it. And God will never fail to act on his, meaning man's, interior being, with the result that a person who at a given moment of his life lacks the clarity of faith or even adherence to religious doctrines can at a future date be enlightened and believe the truth. Okay? This is really, really important. God never fails to act in the direction of our hearts. He's always pursuing us, right? The hound of heaven. That's what I think, at least I might translate it that way at this point. This passage states the permanent ontological relationship between God and man in truth. From the human standpoint, man is open to truth by his very nature, so that his need for truth cannot be extinguished. From the divine standpoint, God will never fail to act on the interior being of a person, so that at any point in a man's life, however deeply and persistently he may be involved in error, there's the definite possibility of his opening himself to the light of truth. Thus, there is affirmed an absolute faith in the person's capacity for truth, corresponding to the increasing divine power involved in truth. The power of truth is the power of God responding to the openness of man's being. Prior to death, man as man does not have the power to seal himself definitively from the truth, because the truth is a divine force pressing on the permanent potential of man's openness. While he may be morally or immorally resistant to that force, he remains ontologically open to it. Now that I understand that's heavy theological language Jim Douglas is using here, but think about it. What he's saying is that there's a deeper drive inside of us for truth that goes even beyond our moral or immoral mistakes. That's how I might translate that. And you have to, when you're dealing with this issue, you have to recognize that that's how we're structured as people. Okay? Third way to read Pachamentaris is from the point of view of love, especially sacrificial, suffering love. Okay? Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, I'm going over. But I got to finish this, so forgive me. I didn't time this right. For the tremendous power, you can't miss the part about love, or the whole thing doesn't work. For the tremendous power of Pachamentaris is not the destructive power of man aspiring to be God, but the loving power of God revealing himself as a servant of man. God speaks through his prophets, and Pachamentaris is the love of God expressed through his human instrument, John the 23rd. The encyclical charts the social expression of love in today's world. A love manifested in total nonviolence and total service to man. Pachamentaris has the power to move men embracing women, Hilaire Belloc, because it embodies the power of a man, that is John the 23rd, who surrendered all to God. Pachamentaris is itself the fruit of his suffering. Commentators have often remarked on the extraordinary purity and serenity of the encyclical's voice, whose doctrine expands like a sea of God's love. Reading Pachamentaris is like gazing to the bottom of a mountain pool. It's pure and clear, yet this godlike purity can be understood fully if you read another book by him called The Journal of the Soul. That's his spiritual diary he kept for 67 years. And the vision of the peace in the encyclical is based, it corresponds to the unity and integrity which was the fruit of his own life of self-giving and self-suffering. The deep unity of mankind which is felt by the reader in every passage of Pachamentaris is a reflection of the spiritual unity of the man Roncalli. He had suffered gradually into a global vision of peace. The serenity of his voice was the serenity of one crucified to the world through Christ. The power of his love was the power of the one who always sought the lot of the powerless. Pope John's idealism was not easy. It was the cold, lifelong agony of love. The peace and joy of John's doctrine was the joy of a man who had left himself behind. He wrote of this piece of selflessness this way. "Let me tell you," he said to a friend, with the heart of a brother, "that now more than ever, it's the case of closing your eyes and hands or ridding yourself completely of the baggage of your selfhood and plunging into the sure and tranquil sea of God's holy will, where alone you will find a measure of peace. Remember John Donne? In his will is our peace. If it's asked how a man can possibly attain that peace on earth which we find described in Pacem in Terris, we might answer in the same way that Pope John did, as he said on June 1st, 1963, 2 days before his death, "I suffer very much, but with love." And as mentioned before, he died fearing that the family he loved would experience the agony of another war. I'm afraid. I fear my children might become involved in a new war. That profound union that he felt with his family, and it triggered his concern for peace. In the last days, there was suddenly manifested to the world the full power of what even his voice in Pacem in Terris could convey only imperfectly. The power of his selfless love offered in sacrifice for the human family. At one stage in this final agony, which drew the world into John's heart, a New York newspaper headlined, "Pope John, powerless to raise arm." But as one believer commented, the world knows nothing of power. He's raising far more than his arm. Thank you for tolerating a little bit longer.